I've got a bike, you can ride it if you like. It's got a basket, a bell and rings and things to make it look good.
Hello and welcome again to what's turning in to be quite an interesting set of videos and series that we're doing. It's generating quite a bit of response, more than what I thought. I want to jump right in again because of just time. It's been contended that my last video that Jesus, his body didn't see any type of corruption. And therefore, since his body didn't see any type of corruption when he died, and then he was raised from the dead, because it's being argued that Jesus' human body was not glorified, and that therefore he was raised from the dead in a non-glorified but an incorrupted body. But that's not the case, and we've argued against Don Preston, but on that matter. But let's jump right into the text in Acts chapter 2, where it's quoted here. Peter says in verse 23, chapter 2, "This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death." So Jesus, again, he died, okay? Physical death is what we're talking about here, not spiritual death. They put him to death, nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead. Now that's the subject matter that we're talking about here. It's the first thing that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, which is this series as a setup. I'm just doing a little side thing here about the particular body of Jesus, the human body of Jesus, the human body. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Jesus was in the agony of death. This is physical death and all that comes along with it. It was impossible for death to keep its hold, meaning that it had its hold, but it couldn't keep his hold. And then he quotes David. And David in Psalm 16 says, "I saw the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, my tongue rejoices. My body," in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the word here is sarx, basar in Hebrew, body, flesh. "My body will also elpis, hope." Now here we have a context of resurrection of the dead, body, which is obviously talking about a human body here, flesh, and hope. And he says here, "My body will also hope." My body will hope. "Because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life, and you will fill me with joy in your presence." And then Peter comments, "Brothers, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, just as Jesus was." 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He died and he was buried. There's a difference. He was raised. "And his tomb is here to this day," meaning that to dust thou art and dust thou shalt return. David died, he's buried in his tomb, and his corpse, his body, is there to this day. "But he was a prophet, and he knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was ahead, he spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of this fact." Now, all the words that we find in 1 Corinthians 15, body, even the word flesh, hope, corruption, resurrection, they're all found in 1 Corinthians 15. And what's interesting here is that the argument is made that Jesus would not see corruption, is that they're using this word for a physical sense of corruption, the physicality of corruption. Now, all the commentaries that I've read on this is merely saying that Jesus did not undergo the agony of death as a human body does go. And when the body is dead, certain things set into, and they're saying, Jesus was not exempt from this. What this psalm is saying and what Peter is saying is making clear in the context the comparison between David, who's been dead for centuries, and he's in the tomb to this day, over and against Jesus, who was dead, who was in the agony of death, who was buried, laid in the tomb, but he's no longer there. In other words, he did not suffer his body to undergo what normally would be, in David's example, laid in a tomb and you stay there for however long. Jesus did not undergo that. He did not see or remain in that state of corruption and decomposition to the place where, it's mummification. There's nothing there except, bones and ashes or whatever. And here, David is saying, my body will live in hope of what? Psalm 16 is a resurrection of the dead passage. It has all the elements and words that we find in 1 Corinthians 15. And it is a bodily hope. My body will hope in what? That I will walk in the new ways of life and in the presence of God. And since that didn't happen to David, but it did happen as we are witnesses, Peter says, of the resurrection of Jesus, then this psalm is prophetic. It's speaking of one who happens to be, genealogically, of the line of David. Because in the scriptures, it is stated that David shall have a seed sit on the throne forever and ever. And since David is obviously not talking about himself, because his body does see decay, it does see corruption, it's in the tomb as we speak, centuries it's been in the tomb when it was buried. But with Jesus, God did not let him remain in corruption. God did not let his body, but his body rather had a hope the same as David's. Because David will be raised from the dead also. The hope of the body being raised from the dead is expressed in Psalm 16. Jesus is raised from the dead in his body from the agony and pains and corruption of death. He is set free from that corruption. He is loosed from that decay. He is glorified and brought out and raised in newness of life. That's what this text is saying. But it has all of the elements of corruption. Corruption of what? Not spiritual corruption, as we would attest in 1 Corinthians 15, because it's not talking, according to Don Preston, it's not talking about physical bodies there. So what corruption is it talking about? Well, the corruption here, the same Greek word in 1 Corinthians 15, that we also find in the Septuagint, is related to a body, flesh, basar, soma. And we know that it's talking about bodies, physical bodies. And the first one to be raised that did not see corruption, never to die anymore in his physical body, is Jesus Christ. Now, Don says that his body, upon the ascension, dematerialized or something happened to it, but Jesus is no longer in his physical human body glorified. Well, when a body is dematerialized or dispersed or made to disappear or whatever, and a soul is separated from that body, that's what the Bible calls death. So apparently Jesus died again, or at least his body did. His body ceased to be. So what we have here is that Jesus is put into a tomb in his body. He's buried, put into a tomb. He's released from the agonies of death, doesn't see corruption the way that we do. We see corruption when we're put into a casket or whatever. And corruption just sets in, Jesus did not see that. He was raised on the third day. Never to see death anymore, except upon his ascension, because then his body dies again. It'd have to die. What is his body still alive? Where is it? It just dematerialized and vanished? Where did it go? Did it die? Now what's interesting, and I want to end with this point, is that it says in Hebrews, and I just caught this the other day, it says in Hebrews, by faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death in the normal fashion that people experience death. It doesn't say that he did not die. In fact, it says the exact opposite. You follow on, verse 13 of Hebrews 11, all these people, that's all the previous people he's talked about up until this point in verse 13, and Enoch is in verse 5. All these people were living by faith when they, that would include Enoch, died. Enoch died. Yes, he was taken up into heaven, and he was no more. He didn't experience death in the normal fashion that anyone does. But according to Hebrews 11:13, he died when he was taken up. Well, how could it say that? Because his body he died. So Jesus, upon his ascension, had to have died again in his body. He went on and then was glorified. So Don would have us believe, I guess. Because he's not in a physical, glorified, transformed body. That's what Don would have us to believe. Because Don wants to transfer that body to the body of Christ, the church, the corporate body view of resurrection, which is Don's view. But anyway, this text in Acts plainly shows that hope of my body, corruption of the body, tomb, death, pangs of death, resurrection, all of these themes that we find talking about David's body and Jesus' body are all the same things that we find in 1 Corinthians 15, where we're also talking about the resurrection of the body. Now that I've said that, I'm going to jump into this text of 1 Corinthians 15 and get a few more video lectures on this, and then hopefully we'll conclude this matter. Okay, I hope you're all having a wonderful, wonderful day.